The land had not seen rain in months. Dust clung to every blade of brittle grass, to the fence posts, to the weary folds of Jonas Hale's coat. Even the sky seemed tired, washed in pale metallic light that blurred the line between horizon and heaven. It was the sort of afternoon when nothing moved but the wind, and even that came thin, whispering over the dead mesquite like an old man's breath. Jonas stood beside the well, a rope coiled in his hand. His fingers cracked and calloused from years of drawing water that grew scarcer by the week. The bucket hit bottom with a hollow thud, the sound echoing up from the dry stone throat. When he hauled it up, the water glimmered faintly, barely enough for the mule, let alone a man and his regrets. He set the bucket down and wiped his brow. His wedding band, dulled with time, caught the evening light for just a heartbeat before he tucked his hand into his pocket. The small cabin behind him leaned against the emptiness like a tired soul. Its windows were clouded with dust. Its porch sagged. Its chimney long gone cold except for the rare nights when he dared light a fire. Inside, the only company Jonas kept was silence, and the faint scent of lavender still lingering in his late wife's shawl, folded neatly on the rocker by the hearth. He lived between memory and obligation. Each sunrise brought another round of chores, mending the corral, feeding the mule, checking the traps. Each sunset brought the same long quiet, broken only by the scrape of his boots on the porch and the sound of wind over the plains. They said the Apaches had been seen again, raiding near the river crossing. The town of Dry Bend was whispering about blood and vengeance, sharpening rifles for a fight that had burned too long already. Jonas had fought once, under the Army's banner, years back, and he carried the guilt of it still. He'd seen what men did when they believed God was on their side. He'd seen children buried under sand, and fires that didn't warm but punished. Now, all he wanted was to keep to himself, to wait out whatever judgment the world still had left. As dusk settled, Jonas fed the mule and leaned against the fence post. The air was thick with the smell of dust and creosote. He could feel the day folding in around him, soft and heavy. That's when he noticed them, 3 shapes far off on the ridgeline, still as stones against the burning horizon. At first he thought they were buzzards perched on rock. Then one shifted, the faint glint of metal catching the last of the light. Riders. Jonas's stomach tightened. He went inside and fetched his rifle from its peg. The stock was worn smooth, the barrel oiled but old. He stepped back out, resting the weapon in the crook of his arm, eyes narrowed. The riders didn't move. The distance between them was wide, deliberate. Scouts, maybe. Apache, most likely. The kind of men the town feared more than drought. For a long while, neither side stirred. The wind drifted between them, carrying the dry sound of crickets. Jonas's thumb brushed the safety on his rifle. He could almost hear Briggs's voice from town. "Shoot first, don't wait for mercy. You'll only get it once," but he didn't raise the gun. Something in him had hardened too long ago to fire without reason. He was tired of war stories, tired of fear. Maybe, deep down, tired of living like every man around him was an enemy. He walked slowly toward the well. The riders watched. He could feel their eyes even from that distance, sharp and unflinching. He filled the tin bucket with what water remained and set it on the stone lip. Then he stepped back, away from it, lowering the rifle until it hung loose at his side. For a moment, the whole desert seemed to hold its breath. Then the riders turned their horses and vanished over the ridge. Jonas stood there until the stars began to pierce the blue. The air cooled, and the coyotes started up their thin, lonely song. When he finally went inside, the fire in the stove was dead, but he didn't bother to relight it. He lay in his cot, staring at the rafters, listening to the wind hum through the cracks in the walls. Sleep came shallow and strange, full of faces and dust. At first light he rose, expecting nothing. He walked to the well, boots crunching over the pale dirt. The bucket was gone. Only a faint ring of damp dust marked where it had stood. A trail led away from it, light prints, narrow, almost delicate, bare feet. Not horses. Jonas knelt, brushing his fingers over the tracks. They had come close in the night, silent as shadows. They could have taken more, his tools, his rifle, even his life. But they hadn't. Only water. He sat back on his heels and looked toward the horizon. The ridgeline was empty again, washed gold by the morning sun. The mule brayed softly behind him, impatient for feed. Jonas filled another bucket from the well, this time without measuring how much was left. He poured a little into a tin cup and drank. The water was warm and tasted of rust, but it steadied him. He thought of his wife, of the scripture she'd read him once before she died. If thine enemy thirst, give him drink. He hadn't understood it then. It sounded like a fool's mercy, but now, standing there alone on the edge of the desert, he began to see the wisdom in it. Maybe mercy wasn't about deserving. Maybe it was about remembering what it felt like to be human. He set the cup down and wiped his mouth. The wind carried a faint whisper through the grass, almost like a voice, soft, distant, and kind. When he went back inside, he paused at the doorway, glancing once more toward the ridgeline. There was no one there, but he felt watched in a way that wasn't threatening, only curious. That night, when the stars returned, Jonas lit a candle and left it burning in the window. Not as a signal, not as a challenge, just as a small, trembling light against the dark. He didn't know if they would come again. He didn't know if the well would hold through winter. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. And somewhere in the hush between the wind and the crickets, he realized he was tired of being afraid. The morning came with a heavy stillness, the kind that warned of rain yet refused to give it. The clouds hung low over the New Mexico plains, bruised and swollen, pressing the horizon into a narrow band of dull light. Jonas Hale stood by the fence line, hammer in hand, driving new nails into warped boards. The mule grazed nearby, tail flicking, the only sound in the wide silence besides the dull rhythm of the hammer. The air smelled of iron and dust. Somewhere, thunder muttered behind the mountains. Jonas paused, resting the hammer against his thigh. His shoulders ached from years of the same motion, build, mend, repair, but nothing he fixed ever stayed whole for long. The fence broke, the well dried, the sky cracked, but did not weep. It was a cruel rhythm, the kind a man learned to live with or die from. He wiped sweat from his brow and looked toward the cottonwood tree near the creek bed, its leaves trembling in the wind. Beneath that tree lay 2 graves, marked with rough-cut stones and faded scripture carved by his own hand. Martha Hale, an infant daughter. The names had worn down over time, just as he had. He remembered the winter when the fever took them both. He'd been too late fetching medicine from town, trapped by snow and pride. The doctor came days after the burial, muttering condolences that felt like ash. Jonas never forgave himself, though he rarely thought about it in words anymore. It lived in him like marrow, that slow ache of surviving what he shouldn't have. By afternoon, the sky turned the color of bruised steel. The wind rose, dragging dust and the smell of wet sage. Jonas secured the shutters, latched the barn doors, and stacked kindling near the stove. When he stepped back onto the porch, lightning flared across the plains, a ragged white scar. The thunder followed like distant cannon fire. He poured himself a cup of coffee, bitter and black, and sat by the window. Rain teased the edge of the land but refused to fall, the kind of storm that lingered, like guilt, just out of reach. Then he saw movement near the barn, a shadow that wasn't his own. Jonas set down the cup and reached for the rifle by the door. The shape flickered again, low to the ground, crouching near the woodpile. The wind hissed through the grass and his pulse quickened. He stepped outside, boots crunching over the hard-packed earth. Lightning flashed again, and for a moment he saw her clearly, an old woman. Thin as a reed wrapped in a torn blanket, her hair matted with gray and dust. She looked up, eyes dark and hollow but not afraid. Jonas lowered the rifle, uncertain. She spoke, words soft and quick in a language he didn't understand. Her voice was rasped by thirst. He hesitated only a moment before motioning toward the porch. She didn't move. The storm broke then, sudden and violent, sheets of rain slashing across the yard. Jonas cursed under his breath and strode forward, gripping her arm gently but firmly. Her skin was cold and papery beneath his calloused hand. "Come on," he said quietly. "You'll drown out here." She made no protest as he half-guided, half-carried her to the cabin. The door slammed shut behind them, the wind howling like a wild thing outside. Inside, the fire still smoldered from earlier. Jonas knelt by it, tossing on dry wood until the flames climbed high again. The woman shivered near the hearth, her blanket dripping. He fetched one of Martha's old shawls from the trunk, soft, faded blue, and draped it over her shoulders. She looked at it as though it were sacred. Jonas filled a tin cup with water and handed it to her. She drank slowly, eyes never leaving his face. When she finished, she whispered a single word. Tala, her name. He nodded. Jonas. The rain hammered the roof as if to drown the silence between them. She spoke again, low, words lost to the wind. He couldn't understand, but something in her tone, gratitude perhaps, needed no translation. She was Apache. He could see it in her braids, in the lines carved deep by wind and grief. Age and hunger had thinned her, but her gaze was steady, proud. Jonas wondered how long she had been walking and from what. He made her a place near the fire and set a pot of beans to warm. The smell filled the small room, mingling with damp wood and smoke. Tala dozed, head bowed, her breathing shallow but even. Jonas sat across from her, watching the flames dance over the iron stove. Lightning lit her face, the fine lines around her mouth, the dark smudge of soot on her cheek. She reminded him of Martha in a way that cut too deep, not in likeness, but in endurance. The same quiet defiance of life's cruelties. When the storm eased, Jonas stepped outside. The night was wet and shining, the air heavy with the scent of earth finally cooled. He looked toward the cottonwood, its leaves dripping silver in the starlight. For the first time in years, the graves there didn't feel so far away. Back inside, Tala had woken. She sat by the fire, combing her long gray hair with careful fingers, dividing it into 3 thin braids. The movement was slow, ceremonial. Jonas stood watching, remembering Martha doing the same each morning, the sound of her comb through hair blending with the murmur of dawn. When Tala noticed him, she didn't startle. She pointed to the pot on the stove, then to him, a silent offer. They ate together, neither speaking. The storm outside gave way to the soft patter of rain on the roof. Later, when she lay down near the hearth, Jonas covered her with an old quilt and sat by the window again. The candle's flame flickered against the glass, reflecting 2 faces, his worn, hers weathered. 2 remnants of lives the world had tried to erase. He watched her breathing steady in sleep, her thin hand resting near the cup of water. He realized then that mercy cost him nothing, not a thing. In a land where blood had bought so much sorrow, it was almost strange how easily compassion could be given. The rain began again, softer this time. Jonas closed his eyes and listened. For once, it didn't sound like morning. It sounded like something trying to grow again. By noon, the wind began to shift. The air that morning had been still, heavy with heat and dust. But now the horizon churned, an ochre wall rising from the earth, rolling toward the ranch like the sea come loose from reason. Jonas Hale knew the signs. He'd seen storms like that before, back when the army rode these plains, storms that could strip the hide from cattle and bury a man alive before he could lift a prayer. He stood by the porch rail, squinting into the growing haze. The sound came first, a hollow moan, like the earth drawing breath. Then the light dimmed, the sun smothered behind curtains of moving sand. He turned back toward the cabin. "Storm's comin'," he said quietly. Tala sat near the hearth, mending the edge of her blanket. She looked up, her dark eyes unreadable, and nodded once. She rose, moving slower than her age allowed, and began gathering small things, her pouch of herbs, the bowl, the piece of blue shawl Jonas had given her. Her calm unnerved him. She moved as if the storm were something familiar, a returning spirit. Jonas shuttered the windows, wedging cloth into the cracks. He carried the small fire from the stove into a clay basin and set it near the hearth, shielding it from drafts. Tala murmured something low and rhythmic, half chant, half prayer. When the first wave of sand struck the cabin, it sounded like the world itself was clawing at the walls. The storm howled through every seam. Dust bled through the gaps, turning the air thick and orange. Jonas sat across from Tala, listening to the wind shriek, feeling the boards tremble beneath his boots. After a while she spoke, her English broken, halting. "Men." "Hunt my son," she said, pressing her palm to her chest. "He no kill. They say he kill white trader." "Not true," Jonas studied her. Her voice carried neither fear nor plea, only the weight of truth too long ignored. "You sure of it?" He asked softly. She nodded once. "They want blood. Always want blood." He leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. "I know that kind of men." Tala's gaze found the fire. "He run far," she said. "They chase, maybe." "Storm hide him," Jonas didn't answer. He thought of the graves beneath the cottonwood, of the years spent measuring sin and mercy by the wrong man's yardstick. The wind wailed outside, shaking the roof. Hours passed in dim orange light. Sand piled against the door. The cabin seemed to shrink under the weight of sound and heat. Tala dozed in the corner, head bent, her fingers still clutching her pouch. Jonas watched the flame flicker low, his thoughts drifting to the voice of his wife, soft, calm, reciting the words he could never forget. "Blessed are the merciful." When the wind finally began to ease, the silence felt unnatural. Jonas stepped to the window, brushed dust from the glass, and peered out. The land was buried in a fine red film. The fences half vanished beneath it. Something caught his eye. A shape slumped near the far post, still as death. Jonas's heart stuttered. He grabbed his hat and rifle, then forced the door open against the heavy drift. The wind still hissed, but weaker now. He trudged through the sand, boots sinking, eyes narrowed against the grit. The figure came into focus, a man, young, bare-chested beneath a torn deerskin vest, one arm slick with blood. Jonas knelt beside him. The wound wasn't deep, but the boy had lost too much already. His skin burned with fever, his breath ragged. Beside him lay a broken bow, and slung over his shoulder, a small medicine pouch marked with beadwork like Tala's. Jonas didn't need to ask. He hooked his arms beneath the stranger and lifted, grunting under the weight. The boy stirred faintly but didn't wake. Jonas carried him across the yard, the sand tugging at his boots, the cabin looming ahead like the last piece of the world still standing. When he staggered inside, Tala was already on her feet. She gasped once, covering her mouth, then hurried forward, touching the young man's face with both hands. "Nakai," she whispered. Jonas laid him on the cot near the fire. Tala tore strips from her blanket and pressed them against the wound, murmuring words he didn't understand. Her fingers were steady, her eyes fierce. "He live," she said. "Need rest. You save him." Jonas shook his head. "Just found him before the coyotes did." Tala's gaze met his, deep and unwavering. "Still save." He poured water into a basin and cleaned the boy's wound, working in silence. The storm outside dwindled to a whisper. When he was done, Nakai slept beneath the quilt, his breathing shallow but strong. Jonas sat by the fire, shoulders slumped. He felt the weight of what he'd done settling over him like a noose. Harboring an Apache warrior accused of murder, it would mean hanging, no question. Yet when he looked at Tala, he couldn't regret it. Her eyes shone with something beyond gratitude, something like faith. The night deepened. Rain began to fall again, thin and steady, washing the dust from the windows. Tala sat humming beside her son, the sound low and ancient. Jonas listened, the melody pulling at something long buried inside him. It reminded him of the songs Martha used to hum while she worked. Soft tunes with no words, meant to fill silence with gentleness. He stared into the fire until the shapes blurred. The boy stirred in his sleep, whispering something in his own tongue. Tala answered quietly, stroking his hair. Jonas turned away, feeling like an intruder on something sacred. He poured himself a cup of coffee gone cold, then sat by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass. He thought of the men who would come hunting, their boots, their rifles, their talk of justice. They would call this treason. They would call it weakness. But Jonas knew better. Weakness was letting the world decide when a man's soul was done. The rain softened, tapering to mist. The smell of wet dust filled the cabin, sharp and clean. Tala's song faded into silence. Jonas looked once more at the sleeping faces near the fire, mother and son bound by blood and exile, and felt a strange peace take hold of him. Somewhere deep inside, a wall had shifted. Mercy, he realized, wasn't a gift. It was a decision. Outside, the storm passed into the distance, leaving the land washed clean beneath the moon. The days that followed the storm settled into an uneasy rhythm. Not peace, not yet, but something close enough to breathe in. The air over the New Mexico plains carried the scent of damp earth and smoke, and the hills shimmered under a pale sun. Jonas Hale moved through his chores with measured purpose, though his eyes drifted often toward the barn, where Nakai, the young Apache man he had saved, rested in the shadows like a hunted animal. Tala, the old woman, had taken to the hearth. She moved with quiet grace, her thin hands steady as she stirred the iron pot or brushed dust from the mantel. Her presence filled the cabin with a sense of something sacred, not belonging to Jonas, nor to her, but to the fragile trust between them. At times, when the wind sighed through the cracks in the walls, she would hum the same low song from the storm, and Jonas would pause, caught by the strange comfort it carried. Nakai healed slowly. His shoulder wound was deep but clean, bound with linen strips Jonas tore from an old shirt. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, the three would sit in silence by the fire, the flames painting their faces in shifting gold and shadow. Sometimes Jonas caught the young man studying him, suspicion still sharp in his gaze, but there was something else there too. A searching, a question that neither dared to voice. Jonas showed Nakai how to mend a bridle one afternoon. The young man's fingers, deft and sure, braided the cracked leather with a skill Jonas had never seen. "Strong now," Nakai said quietly, holding up the piece. Then, after a moment, he pulled a thin strip of hide from his belt and showed Jonas how to weave it differently, a pattern that crossed itself 3 times before binding tight. "For strength," Nakai said. "For home," Jonas nodded. He didn't ask what it meant, but he tied one later, wrapping it around the handle of his old rifle. Somehow, the weapon felt less lonely that way, but the silence between them held more than shared work. It held questions that pressed down like heat before a storm, about loyalty, about justice, about whether mercy could survive in a land that fed on revenge. By midweek, the quiet broke, the sound of hooves carried on the wind. Faint at first, then nearer, 2 riders coming fast along the trail. Jonas's pulse quickened. He stepped to the window and saw dust rising from the flats, 2 men cutting toward the cabin with purpose. "Tala," he said quietly. She understood at once. She guided Nakai toward the back room, her hand trembling only slightly as she closed the door. Jonas took his rifle from the wall but didn't cock it. He set it beside the doorway, visible enough to mean caution, not threat. The riders came to a halt outside, Deputy Crow, his badge glinting in the sunlight, and beside him, Harlan Briggs. Jonas hadn't seen Harlan in years, not since the war ended. The man still carried hate like a brand, the kind that never cooled. "Evening, Hale," Briggs said, spitting into the dust. "Heard tell there were Apaches spotted near the river last night. You seen anything?" Jonas met his eyes, steady as iron. "Can't say I have." Crow looked past him toward the barn, squinting. "Tracks going both ways down your road," he said. "Fresh ones. Had a stray mule wander off. Found her this morning. Might be that." Jonas kept his voice low, unshaken. His hand rested near the rifle but didn't move for it. Briggs dismounted, boots crunching on dry soil. "Funny thing," he said, circling slow. "Folks say you've been keeping to yourself more than usual. Strange company, maybe?" Jonas's jaw tightened. "Only company I've got is the wind and my mule," he said. "Neither talks much." Crow's eyes flickered with unease. He wasn't here for blood, just for order. But Briggs wanted proof of hate. "Don't lie to me, Hale," Briggs hissed, stepping closer. "You remember what they did to our men?" "To women, too. You start helping their kind, and you're no better than them." Jonas stared at him, his face unreadable. "You still fighting the same war, Harlan?" he asked quietly. "Seems to me it's over for most men." For a long moment no one breathed. The air crackled with something dangerous, the ghost of every grudge left unburied. Finally, Crow spoke. We'll be riding the valley through the week. If you see anything, you tell me. I'll do that, Jonas said. The two men rode off, leaving a swirl of dust behind them. Only when they vanished over the ridge did Jonas step back inside. He set the rifle down slowly, his heart beat steady again but heavy with what he knew. The peace here was fragile, and one mistake would bring fire down on them all. That night, he sat by the hearth staring into the flames. Tala came to stand beside him, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her expression calm but knowing. She placed her hand gently on his arm, the gesture quiet as breath. No words were needed. Jonas looked into the fire and felt something shift within him. Not fear, not anger, but resolve. The man who once sought only to survive was gone. In his place sat a man ready to defend what fragile good still lived in the ashes. Outside, the wind swept across the plains, whispering over the land like the breath of the dead. Inside, beneath the roof of rough-hewn timber, three souls shared one silent promise: to endure, no matter what came next. The frost came early that morning, silvering the plain in a thin veil of light. Jonas woke before dawn, breath clouding the cold air, every board in the cabin creaking under the weight of the wind. The world felt still, too still, the kind of stillness that warns of trouble long before sound carries it. Tala was already awake, tending to the small fire. Her shawl hung loose about her shoulders, her expression distant, unreadable. She looked toward the window, then at Jonas. "Men come," she whispered softly, and though her voice was frail, it carried certainty. Jonas stepped outside, his boots crunching on frost. The horizon glowed pale rose where the sun struggled to rise. Then he saw them. 4 riders cresting the ridge, rifles across their saddles, led by Harlan Briggs. The man's figure was unmistakable, broad and rigid as a stone carving. Jonas's pulse steadied. He'd known this would come. Some storms couldn't be outlasted. They had to be met head-on. He called softly through the door. "Keep low." "Stay quiet." Tala nodded and moved to the back, where Nakai waited, already tense, eyes sharp with awareness. The young man gripped a hunting knife, his wound still healing but his stance firm. "No run," he said quietly. "No fear." Jonas looked at him. The boy who should have been his enemy, now standing like a son ready to defend what little they had. "No fear," Jonas echoed. The riders slowed near the barn, their horses snorting clouds into the cold air. Briggs called out, his voice like gravel grinding on iron. "Jonas Hale! Come out and make it easy!"
"We know he's here!"
Jonas stepped from the porch, rifle in hand but not raised. "You've no right on my land, Briggs," he said. Briggs spat into the dirt. "Got every right. The law's on my side. That Injun's a murderer." "He's no murderer," Jonas said. "Just hunted." One of the deputies shifted uneasily in his saddle. "Maybe we should talk to the marshal first," but Briggs cut him off with a snarl. "Talk's for cowards." He dismounted, boots striking the ground, eyes burning with a hatred too long tended. "Step aside, Hale." Jonas didn't move. "You'll go through me first." The moment held, brittle as glass. Then a boot scraped, a gun cocked, and the spell broke. Gunfire cracked through the morning. The first bullet split a post by Jonas's shoulder. He dropped to one knee, returning fire not at men, but at horses, a soldier's aim to disable, not destroy. Briggs's mare screamed, rearing, and threw him hard into the dust. Nakai burst from the barn as 2 deputies circled wide. His movements were swift, silent. The grace of the hunted turned to defiance. He fired once, grazing one man's arm, then darted behind the trough. Jonas's rifle barked again, splintering the rail beside another's boot. The fight was brief but violent, smoke, shouting, the crack of gunpowder filling the air with bitterness. Then came the sound that changed everything, glass shattering, the whoosh of flame. A lantern had fallen near the haystack. Fire leapt hungry and wild, crawling up the side of the barn in seconds. "Fire!" Someone shouted, but it was too late. The barn roared alive, the blaze licking at the rafters, painting the morning in orange fury. Jonas ran toward it, the heat searing his face. Tala cried out from the doorway. "No, Jonas!" He ignored her. The barn held their grain, their tools, and Nakai's few belongings. But before he reached the door, a figure stumbled out. One of the deputies, blood on his sleeve, dazed and coughing from smoke. Nakai was right behind him, guiding him to safety. The deputy fell to his knees, gasping. Nakai could have left him. No one would have blamed him. But he didn't. He turned back once toward the fire, then to Jonas, eyes reflecting both sorrow and strength. Briggs, still half stunned on the ground, lifted his revolver with a trembling hand, aiming at Nakai's back. Jonas fired first, the bullet striking the dirt by Briggs's wrist, shattering the gun's grip. "Enough!" Jonas shouted. "It ends here!" Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the burning barn. Briggs froze, face twisted with fury and disbelief. "You'll hang for this," he hissed. Jonas lowered his rifle. "Maybe," he said, voice steady. "But I'll hang a man, not a coward." The surviving deputies pulled Briggs up and dragged him toward their horses. No one spoke. When they rode off, their silhouettes faded into the smoke and rising dawn. Jonas turned back to the fire. The barn was collapsing now, its roof caving in with a mournful groan. The air smelled of cedar, ash, and everything that once was. He and Nakai worked side by side, pulling what little they could from the flames. A few tools, a saddle, a half-burned Bible. Tala joined them, tears streaking her soot-covered face. When the blaze finally died, the sun had climbed high, washing the land in a strange golden calm. The barn was gone. But in its ashes, Jonas felt something like release. He stood, chest heaving, watching the smoke rise into the cold blue sky. His hands trembled, not from fear but from the weight that had finally lifted. Tala came to him then. Her eyes, dark as storm clouds, held both grief and gratitude. She took a braid of her gray hair, the one she had worn since the night he found her, and pressed it into his palm. "Life continues," she said softly. "Even from fire." Jonas closed his hand around it. The braid was warm, smelling faintly of smoke and cedar. He felt in that small gift everything words could never hold: forgiveness, endurance, love, without need for claim. The sky turned pale gold above them, the land still smoldering below. For the first time in years, Jonas didn't feel alone. The weeks that followed the fire passed like a long breath held between seasons. Smoke no longer haunted the hills, though the air still carried a faint scent of ash whenever the wind turned east. The land had begun to heal, blackened soil giving way to new grass, charred posts standing as quiet memorials to all that had burned. Jonas Hale moved through those days with a calm that felt foreign, as if time itself had slowed to let him reckon with what remained. He rebuilt the corral fences one plank at a time. The work was steady, honest, and it left him bone-tired in the good way, the kind of exhaustion that came not from fear or sorrow, but from purpose. Tala and Nakai stayed on, helping where they could. Nakai's shoulder had healed to a thin white scar, and his silence carried the weight of a man who had seen too much too young. Tala moved softly through the cabin, humming sometimes, her song like a prayer stitched into the air. At night they shared meals by the hearth, beans, coffee, bread, simple food, sacred for being shared. But peace in such country never lasted long. One late morning, while Jonas was fixing a hinge on the barn's new door, he heard hooves in the distance, 4 riders coming slow. He knew the rhythm of official boots on dry ground. The law had finally come. He wiped his hands, set down the hammer, and stepped out to meet them. The men wore dust and badges both, their faces drawn by travel and duty. The lead rider, Marshal Denton, dismounted first, a tall man with weathered eyes and a tone that spoke of fairness edged by fatigue. "Mr. Hale," the marshal began, tipping his hat. "We've come about the trouble here. Word's gone round, shots fired, barn burned, men wounded. We're here to get it straight." Jonas nodded once. "You'll have it straight." He led them to the well, where the earth still bore the marks of hooves and boots from that violent dawn. He told it plain, how the men had come armed, how he'd defended his home, how the fire had caught and burned what could not be saved. He spoke of no hate, no vengeance, just truth. When he finished, the wind carried the silence between them. The marshal looked to his men. They said nothing, You say the Apache boy was here, Denton said finally. He's gone now? Jonas met his gaze, unflinching. He was wounded. I gave him shelter. He's not the killer they claim. The marshal studied him for a long moment. You've always been a soldier of your own kind, Hale. Some call that dangerous. Jonas's voice was quiet even. I reckon it's only dangerous to those who fear peace more than war. That seemed to settle it. The marshal exhaled, the hardness in his face easing. You'll hear no more from us, he said. World's seen enough killing. Maybe you're right. Maybe this land needs fewer guns and more wells. He tipped his hat again, mounted, and with the others rode off down the trail. Their figures dwindled into the heat shimmer, until only dust remained. Jonas stood there a while, watching them go. When he turned, Tala was by the doorway, her blanket draped around her shoulders. Nakai stood beside her, his horse saddled, a coil of rope and a small pouch tied to the saddle horn. The time had come for them to return to their people. They did not speak of it. They didn't need to. Some goodbyes are born of quiet understanding. Tala approached first. Her steps were slow, her eyes steady. She removed her blanket, old, patched with pieces of many colors, and placed it gently around Jonas's shoulders. For warmth, she said softly. And for remembering, Jonas's throat tightened. I'll remember, he said. Nakai extended his hand, not the handshake of settlers, but palm to palm, the way warriors share respect. Jonas met it, their eyes locked, two men divided by birth, but bound by the same fire that had tried to destroy them. Then, without ceremony, the two mounted their horses. Tala turned once, her gray braid catching the sunlight. Nakai lifted a hand in silent farewell. They rode west, toward the red horizon, where the desert met the sky. Jonas watched until they were no more than faint shapes swallowed by distance. The wind rose again, stirring the dry grass around the well. The bucket sat where it always had, dented, sun-warmed, a relic of that first night when everything began. He walked to it slowly, lowering the rope, hearing the creak of the old pulley as the bucket descended into the darkness below. The splash of water echoed faint and clean. When he drew it up, sunlight flashed on its rim, a shimmer of life in a land that had nearly forgotten it. Jonas lifted the bucket, poured a dipper full, and drank. The water was cool, sharp, real. It tasted of earth and iron and memory. He drank again, deeper this time, until it spilled from the corners of his mouth and into his beard. For the first time in years, he felt no weight in his chest, no anger, no ache, no ghosts clawing at his sleep. Only stillness, only peace. He set the bucket down beside the well and leaned on the rail, watching the sky open wide above him. Clouds drifted slow, and somewhere far off, thunder murmured. Not a warning now, but a promise. The war had ended, not with surrender, but with silence. And in that silence, Jonas Hale, the poor rancher who once offered water to his enemies, found what he'd been thirsting for all along, forgiveness, not from others, but from himself.